Rory, thank you so much for joining this Liberty Ventures podcast. Now, for anyone who's really not familiar with Ogilvy or your background, I'd love it if you could just start with a brief overview of what's led to who you are and what you're up to today.
So, I could go back to sort of early childhood, but suffice to say that I left university having studied classics, not really knowing what to do. I spent a year training to be a teacher and then decided I couldn't quite face going school, university, and then back to a school. So, applied to various ad agencies and was, I think, very, very lucky. I think it was just one of those um, a perfect combination of time and place that I started work as a graduate trainee in what was then the direct marketing part of Ogilvy, or Ogilvy and Mather, as it was then called. That was then called Ogilvy and Mather Direct, now called Ogilvy One. And it was effectively, I think, the perfect place in terms of both culture and, of course, the discipline of direct marketing, which then, of course, became turbocharged with the advent of digital media. And so, I was just privileged to be, I think, in a lucky place at a lucky time. Ogilvy itself was founded in the United States. Well, complicated, but effectively was founded in the United States by David Ogilvy, who was an expat Brit who had spent his time, I think, in World War II working with people, including Ian Fleming, in effectively the British Secret Service, I think in particular trying to get the United States to enter World War II, which plan ultimately succeeded. And then spent a time variously as tobacco farmer and market research executive before founding what became, I think, one of the two or three most interesting advertising agencies of the second half of the 20th century. And so I was lucky enough, I met him once actually, I was lucky enough to do that as well. But it was just a very, very um, pertinent and beautifully relevant time at which to start a career, effectively 6 years before the web came along. I also had a second privilege, which was that my brother was still is an astrophysicist, um, but he was then in the early 90s. He was in Berkeley, California, where he effectively roomed with someone who'd previously been the roommate of Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. And Tim Berners-Lee being effectively the father of the web, I got to hear about all that disproportionately early. I failed to turn it into $1 billion fortune, but it did at least mean that I was sort of, 6 months ahead of the curve when that hit. And so that was also a lucky accident of timing, really.
So there's a lot for us to go on there, but you also haven't really gone into some of the other incredible things that you've done in the advertising space. You've written several books, and you really
Yeah.
have helped push the world of advertising forward. And so I'm actually really curious to hear how it's evolved over the course of your career. You talked about direct marketing, which for anyone who may not know what this originally was because they're so familiar with the digital world now,
Of
this
course.
this was and still is to a certain extent sending physical letters out in order for people
Yeah.
in order to discover things.
So the only individually addressable media were really the telephone and the post, the physical post. And so, it was sometimes called database marketing because you had a database of customers and you wrote to them. According to various stories, it was actually invented by Benjamin Franklin, funnily enough, when he ran a bookshop in Philadelphia. He
Interesting. I haven't heard this yet.
I, to be honest, I've never quite been able to verify it, although it seems to have appeared in the Financial Times. Enough people believe it for it to be possibly true. Um, and he took to effectively, when he ran a bookshop in Philadelphia, obviously some of his customers lived some distance away. And of course, effectively, Franklin had created the postal service. So he would then write to customers and suggest, exactly as Amazon does today, with people who like this also like that. People who bought this also bought that. Franklin would do effectively the 18th century equivalent of that by writing to people and suggesting other books by authors they'd bought before, or books that he thought were complementary to the kind of books they liked previously. So the other form of it was, of course, where you ran a press ad, which solicited a direct response from the customer. In other words, when we use the word direct, it meant that you sold directly to the customer. You ran an ad in the newspapers. People would reply with a coupon, which was coded. There was generally a code in the coupon which related to both in which publication it had appeared and which creative execution it represented. And that made possible something which was the testing of obviously different media on the one hand, but also different creative approaches. And so, interestingly, if we go back to the early history of this, the advertising industry effectively invented the randomized control trial probably about 60 or 70 years before it really became popular in, for example, medicine or other forms of the human sciences. The way it worked, this is an interesting bit of history, and I should research this a bit more, but American and British newspapers that were produced in volume were produced on two presses in parallel. And I don't know whether this was at the behest of the advertising industry, but somebody ingenious said, if you place on one press one creative execution and a different advertisement in another creative execution, and then you interleave the newspapers as they come off the two presses, or in some cases, four presses. So it was either A, B, A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. That was important because obviously if newspapers from the different presses went to different locations, it would invalidate the test. But because you interleaved the newspapers, A, B, A, B, A, B, you could assume that pretty much the people who got execution A and the people who got execution B were representative samples. In other words, there was no geographical distribution of the print output to skew your results. Then you could confidently say that you could confidently then say that if advertisement A drew 30% more coupons than advertisement B, then in future you should run a hell of a lot more of A and a hell of a lot less of B. So it was effectively, this, by the way, I think was being pioneered certainly in the Edwardian era, possibly in the late Victorian era. And of course, what these were, thinking back on it, nobody thought of them as such at the time, but they were social science experiments performed, at enormous scale. And very quickly in this form of advertising, you learnt that, just as an interesting detail, you weren't allowed to test different prices, for example, or different fundamental offers, because the newspapers argued, I think with some justification, it isn't fair for some of our readers to be given a better deal than other readers. And so the price had to be the same of what you offered. You couldn't offer credit terms on one and none on the other. But in all other ways, you could test totally different press executions. There was also DRTV, of course, which you'll know, QVC being the most sort of probably the most obvious, but there were also things like late night infomercials that came along later. But essentially the origins of this form of advertising were actually quite scientific. And what you learnt very quickly was that the kind of things that A, economics would tell you was rational, and B, the kind of things that people told you in market research didn't have nearly as much predictive value as a really solid, well-grounded test. And it also meant, there are wonderful books since. There's one by, I think, Timothy Wilson called Strangers to Ourselves. It was also highly revealing of human psychology, to the extent that people would always tell you that they'd be much more influenced by, an offer of 10% off than an offer of a free cuddly bear. But when it came to actually testing the reality of the thing, you very often found the reverse. And so it was highly revealing of the fact that, large parts of the unconscious could be reached by advertising in a way that in a way that market research simply couldn't reveal, because nobody's going to tell you that kind of thing. Inherently a wonderful place. David Ogilvy always said that where possible, you should start your career, particularly as a copywriter, working in direct marketing so that you learn what works. He was, a highly creative figure, but also absolutely on the money in terms of effectiveness of advertising. And so, as a consequence, in the period before the internet became a thing, I mean, the internet had existed for quite a few years beforehand, but when the web effectively made the internet a consumer proposition rather than an academic and military one, this was actually a great place to be. I would argue now that things have gone far too far in the opposite direction. And this often happens. I would argue absolutely down a hill for the fact that it is good to be able to measure the effect of your advertising. We've now created a world where unless you can measure it, you can't do it. And I see increasingly, by the way, that's a trend in large parts of business where the need to quantify can actually override the freedom to make a good decision. In other words, I think business has become obsessed with this false god of perfect quantification. And I think in marketing, there will always be things you should do and should do extensively, which you can't perfectly measure, but that shouldn't be an obstacle to doing them.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that marketing and advertising's principles have remained constant throughout history, even with new technology and the new
Um,
types of advertising available today. Is that right?
there are, I would say, there are certain. Okay, this will vary because obviously there are cultural and contextual differences. When any human being makes a decision, um, they and this might be an area where actually Eastern thinking is rather better than Western, in that there's a generalization, but that in the West, when somebody does something, we tend to attribute it to their personality. In other words, something innate in them or something about their character. In the East, they're more likely to look at the circumstances and context within which they made a decision. So the standard way in which this is often voiced is that in if you have a serial killer who suddenly appears in the United States, people, or a school shooter, people will immediately leap to a description of his personality, i.e., bit of a loner, kept himself to himself, etc., etc. Whereas in the East, they will say he was under considerable stress at work. They will look for external events that drove the
Mm.
behavior. I'm not saying neither culture is obviously 100% one way or the other, but it's a tendency in terms of looking for explanations. And obviously, the same person in different circumstances will make very different decisions in a different context, in a different mood, even, will make very different decisions. But at the same time, there are, this is not the laws of physics, but there are general recurring patterns which you would be well advised not to ignore. That's the way I put it. So what I always say when we run a behavioral science practice is we cannot tell you perfectly what to do. What we can do is surprise you with what might be worth testing. So we might go to somebody and say, this little detail here in your website, for example, in the design of your website seems relatively trivial. However, if you test different approaches, you may find that one or two new approaches will actually achieve a kind of butterfly effect. In other words, it will pay back, manyfold. And one of the things I most encourage, I was talking to a wonderful, she's actually an American resident in the UK called Margaret Heffernan, who's just written a book effectively on embracing uncertainty. And she argues that we are overwhelmingly, and I think business culture makes, values decisiveness to an extent where people are now dangerously unhappy to say, I'm not sure, I need to find out, let's investigate this. And they also have this slightly naive belief that the data will tell us what to do, which is a convenient belief because you can never be blamed for doing what the data tells you to do. Okay. But actually, one of the things Margaret was saying is she finds it absolutely baffling how little businesses test and experiment. And she came up with a wonderful phrase this morning, which is she said, actually, people say, well, what if the test doesn't work? Okay. And she said, in a funny kind of way, all tests work because even if they fail, you still learn. Okay. If you do something which seems wonderfully sensible and the opposite happens, which, by the way, is it's by no. I mean, I think there are tests where you can say it's highly unlikely this will have a downside, and the upside may be considerable, and you should always engage in those tests because it's a very asymmetric outcome. For example, we made British Airways at one point, a seven-figure sum by changing the button from Find Flights to Find My Flights. Okay, now the point about that thing is, those are the kind of tests which Jeff Bezos would call them a two-way door. There's not much actual irreversible commitment to doing them, and the potential gains can be huge. And it's a mistake to argue those things to death, because in the event that that doesn't work, which is, I mean, it's not impossible, but in the event that it doesn't work, you just reverse it very quickly. And what we tend to do in business is we make two mistakes. We test too little, but we also sometimes just apply too much rigor. So that one of Bezos, I think, is a very interesting decision scientist, or at least his approach to decision making is unusually nuanced and intelligent. And one of the things he noticed as a flaw in business is obviously there are irreversible decisions, like you build a 10 million square foot distribution hub, north of Memphis. That's a pretty hefty commitment. It's irreversible. You need to make that a pretty rigorous decision, because if you cock it up, you really are trapped. Whereas he argued there are an awful lot of things where, to be absolutely honest, he called them two-way doors. If you don't like what you see through the door, you just walk back. And I think that's a fair observation, that we tend to see the quality of rigor as emblematic as of the quality of the decision. And actually, if you bake probability into the decision, and you say, well, what are the possible scenarios that emerge after this, and what happens if, for example, our test doesn't work very well? And the answer to that is, will you stop doing it very quickly? In which case, the downside is measurable and the upside is potentially disproportionately high. Any good poker player would always take those odds. Okay, it's kind of tails I don't lose very much, heads I win. And I don't think. One of the interesting things that happened at Amazon was that apparently the person who initially made the case for launching AWS, or Amazon Web Services, didn't do a sterling job of making the case, and people were pulling the whole thing to pieces. At which point Jeff apparently said, look, this is a two-way door. We've got to invest a lot in bandwidth and processing power and everything else. We got to do that anyway because we're Amazon. If we can sell that on to other people, whoop-de-doo, fine and dandy. And if we can't, well, we haven't lost very much anyway. There's not much to be lost in trying. And those are the kind of things where I think we do need to. There's a great book, by the way, Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets. She's a former professional poker player.
It is a great book.
And so, one of the strangest things is how little attention we pay as humans to thinking about decisions and thinking about, different ways we could approach decisions, different questions we could ask, different ways we could define the problem. And I think the reason is that we do have an inherent psychological tendency that, broadly speaking, once we've rationalized something, we consider the job done. I've come up with a rational explanation for why we should do this. Consequently, because it's rational, all other considerations are somehow wrong or suboptimal, and move along now, nothing to see here. And actually, it's very, very possible to be highly rational and completely wrong. Okay, and yet we don't really consider that possibility. It's also, by the way, it's also possible to be right and fail. That's something poker players would know, that you can make absolutely the right bet under the circumstances, given the information available, and you can fail. We're also prone to that thing that Daniel Kahneman called whizziati, which is what you see as all there is. So people inherently are reluctant to say, I need more information. I don't know enough to make a decision here. I'm not comfortable with the information I have. Let's explore further. What we tend to do is we'll take whatever information lies to hand and we'll then construct a sort of rapid on-the-fly model using that limited information. and we'll then proceed from there with the kind of confidence we'd show if we'd had all the information we needed. So, I mean, one interesting thing I've been talking about quite a lot is I think, really good decision making is a bit like police work. And what I mean by that is police work actually accepts the fact that there's an investigative phase and then there's an evidential phase. Ultimately, yes, you've got to prove it. Okay, I get that. You can't, you can't imprison someone for 20 years on the basis of, a suspicion or whatever. Ultimately, yes, you should proceed towards evidence. However, what I think we've lost is the acknowledgement that we don't have enough information. And by the way, we also probably don't acknowledge the fact that context may have changed, that what worked in 2017 no longer works in 2025. And I think as a consequence of that, we've telescoped. One question that always fascinates me that the police ask when you think about it, okay, is they will go door to door if someone's murdered and they'll ask a question like, did anyone notice anything unusual last night? Now, when you think about that, that is about the most open-ended question you can possibly ask. The answer could be literally anything. The dog didn't bark in the night if you're Sherlock Holmes. It could be, I heard a scream. It could be nothing, okay? It could be a strange van was parked outside. None of that stuff has any evidential value. You can't make a decision. Well, you can make a decision on the basis of it, but the only decision you can make is, I need to investigate this further. What you can't convict on the basis of it. But that's for later. And I think Margaret Heffernan's point that we're so deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity that we seek to remove it from our lives as hastily as we possibly can. And she makes the point that creative people have a distinctive characteristic, or people who are prone to coming up with creative solutions or ideas have a distinctive characteristic, which is I mean, for whatever reason, and one of them could be laziness, by the way, sheer idleness, okay, but they are actually happy existing in a state of not doing, not knowing. And, one of the benefits of waiting before you make a decision is simply that new information may emerge, or a new idea or insight may emerge, or inside your own brain, you may look at a problem in a completely different way and realize that what seemed to be problematic no longer is. So, I mean, obviously, in your business, in investment, it's very, very interesting in the sense that people are desperate to try and construct kind of rules. And by the way, I think there are checklists. I'm not such an anarchist that I'd say there's no value to checklists. I think it always pays to go, is there something? The cop thing will be, have we forgotten to collect DNA? Have we looked here? Did we do a search of that? I think checklists are immensely valuable because they prevent you from just sort of either willfully or accidentally overlooking things. But I don't think there's actually a process in terms of where you handle information, because what information emerges then determines what further information you look for. I mean, by the way,
Rory,
an interesting aside on this is I thought that in the COVID outbreak, some of the failures of this need for complete certainty, I thought, were made manifest, where people were first of all, the need for experimentation was much greater than people acknowledged. People went on information that was relevant to previous coronaviruses, even though this one was novel. And then I noticed people using phrases like "the science tells us," when there's no such thing as the science. Okay. Science is not a singular. And it strikes me as really interesting, unless there was an ulterior motive. It was interesting to me that they were so slow to clock that it was basically transmitted. It was airborne transmission in confined spaces over a period of time. And I've got a friend who's a doctor who investigated this, who said you could have avoided nearly every, you would probably have had to close down pubs, restaurants, churches, confined spaces. But in warmer climates, we possibly could have led our lives perfectly comfortably, wearing masks wearing masks and not much more. But again, I mean, I support the precautionary principle there. It's not worth playing fast and loose. but I think it was fairly obvious there wasn't actually, that the transmission conditions were quite quite clearly delineated, the conditions under which it would have been transmitted, and you probably could have made things quite a lot easier.
Rory, I can see why The Guardian called you one of the most unlikely TikTok sensations of the day and how you've been so successful on TikTok and social media. And I want to say thank you for sharing all of this. I wish we had more time, but is there anything else that you want to share that we haven't gotten to? I know there's so much more that we could get to.
Simply that, very simple thing. I would argue that this is just a useful insight. If you're talking to people who have a great invention, the natural assumption is, which I made myself, that the bigger your idea, the less marketing you need. And we traditionally looked at things and thought, well, obviously, if people are deciding between two near identical lagers, or they're looking to decide between two, fairly well functioning washing detergents, then obviously marketing is going to have an effect, and people will choose the one where the message is better conveyed to them. But they always thought that we don't need marketing if we've got a really big idea. And my contention would be that uh, actually, my contention would be that uh, when you have a big idea, it requires a lot of behavioral change. Humans find changing their behavior fundamentally difficult. It requires them to abandon an old habit. Sometimes in the early days of a new behavior, it requires them to do things that nobody they know does. I had an early mobile phone, and you would get abuse from using it on the street. Okay, we forget all this stuff. And actually, humans find behavioral change difficult. So a big idea actually requires a lot of marketing thought, not a little. And I think we've often made this mistake, that people in the tech world often assume that my idea is so great it will win on its superior product attributes alone, and there's no need to actually practice marketing or translate what I can do into human language or human benefits. And I think that's I think that's fundamentally wrong. And my argument would be that to get people to do anything new or innovative, to give you something contemporary, the mobile phone, that's done and dusted. Okay, we've created a social norm there. You're considered now an oddball if you don't have a mobile phone, etc., etc., etc. That's no longer. But I spent 10 years of my working life, not all of it, but I mean, long periods of my working life for 10 years were persuading people to get proper broadband at home rather than dial up, or in the early days, persuading them to get dial up internet. Okay, would you believe it? Okay, that sounds ridiculous now. You wouldn't move to a house with no internet access. But at the time, that was a 10-year process. The iPhone did not take off that quickly. I mean, that was one of the most successful product launches of the last 30 years. But if you actually look at the data, it's still that sigmoid curve of early adopters. And at the moment, we have things, I think, like solar panels. But the way I describe it is that in many cases, actually, I think very good products and ideas have failed because no one's actually worked out how to market them. I don't think you can market a crap product successfully, except in very weird areas like sort of fashion. I mean, there are weird sort of outliers where products which purely have a display value, for example, and have no utility. You can the French fashion industry, to an extent, is 90% marketing. Um, but at the same time, I think one of the things we don't understand with things like solar panels, heat pumps, electric cars, etc., that you will always encounter, at the very least, friction and sometimes pushback. People don't like being told that what they've always done is wrong. Okay. We probably forget that because we're naturally kind of exploratory, innovative people. But there's a very large swathe of the population who kind of resents the fact that they're being told that something that they've made work for 30 years is now wrong. But all of those things, I think, are going through that same period of sort of painful adoption. You could extend that to air fryers, fantastic category, which I was a very, very early advocate of. And I could see it was one of those technologies which would ultimately succeed significantly because nobody I knew who bought an air fryer ever went back. Nobody ever said, okay, I can do without. When I move house, I'll get rid of that and I'll do without it. So it clearly had a really strong value. But again, you still encounter all of those things. It's not just, I mean, in many cases, the financial element of this may be secondary to the emotional component. And yet, what we tend to do is we hand problems to economists who assume that everything's just a matter of cost and benefit. And consequently, I think there's a huge amount of misdirection of effort.
That is such an important lesson
Yeah,
to leave the Liberty Ventures Network with. Rory, we need to get more time for another podcast and get you out to one of our events soon. We're going
I'd
to
be
make that
absolutely
happen
delighted.
because there's so much more I want to get into with you.
I'd be absolutely delighted. Let me know about all your events. I'd be so happy. Wonderful idea.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rory.